As Zeus, the king of the gods, sat on his throne on Mount Olympus, he looked down upon the troubled land of Greece. It was ravaged by war, and ferocious beasts prowled the land. Zeus knew what had to be done. A hero had to rise, a hero that he would father, who could unite the people and rid the world of these terrible monsters. This hero was to be Heracles, later known as Hercules to the Romans. Zeus then chose the beautiful Alcmena to be the mother of Heracles, as she was a descendant of the famous hero Perseus. While her husband was at war, Zeus impregnated Alcmena, planning to make his son the next great king of Greece. Little did he know that his wife Hera, the queen of the gods, had been watching these events unfold. In the past, she had sat idle, while Zeus had fathered many illegitimate children, but this time she had finally had enough. When Zeus swore an oath to give kingship to the next descendant of Perseus, thinking it would be his son Heracles, Hera saw an opportunity to get revenge on her husband. When Heracles was about to be born, she used her magic to delay the birth, while also speeding up the birth of another descendant of Perseus, a child called Eurystheus. As Eurystheus had been born just mere seconds before Heracles, he had become the next descendant of Perseus, with Zeus being forced to give him the kingship instead. While Zeus could do nothing about his son's lost kingdom, he did manage to get his own revenge on Hera. After Heracles was born, Zeus brought him up to Hera's bedchamber on Olympus. As she was sleeping, Zeus placed the infant on Hera's breast, where Heracles was able to feed on the goddess's milk, stealing some of her divine power for himself. Startled, Hera woke up and threw the baby off her chest, with milk spraying across the heavens. This milk would settle out in space, becoming known as the Milky Way. Zeus chuckled to himself and brought Heracles back to Earth, placing him in a crib next to his mother. Back on Olympus, Hera was furious. This was too great an embarrassment for her to ignore, and so in an attempt to kill Heracles, she sent 2 snakes into his crib. To her surprise, Heracles just giggled and grabbed a snake in each hand, strangling them with the strength he had just stolen from her. Hera looked down at the scene in rage, promising to make Heracles' life as difficult as possible. Growing up, Heracles received an education from some of the most renowned masters of Greece, in all things from archery to music. One thing that became clear from a young age was that Heracles had a very short temper. This, combined with his supernatural strength, made him dangerous to both his friends and enemies alike. Linus, his music teacher, found this out the hard way when he was teaching the young hero to play an instrument called the lyre. Heracles lacked the finesse to play the instrument and became infuriated by the constant corrections of his teacher. After some particularly harsh criticism, he ended up smashing Linus on the back of the head with the instrument, killing him instantly. While Heracles only received a minor punishment, his temper would go on to cause him issues in his later life. The young hero got his first taste of battle when his foster father Amphitryon, the leading general of the city of Thebes, was killed in a bloody war with the neighbouring minions. With his foster father dead, Heracles took his place as general and marched the Theban army against the minions. Along the way, Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, appeared before him, having been sent by Zeus to aid the young hero. She brought gifts from the gods, shining weapons and armour from the forge of Olympus. Heracles thanked the goddess and charged into battle with Athena's gifts, avenging his foster father by destroying the minion armies. Upon returning to Thebes, Heracles was greeted by the thankful Theban king, who gifted the hero his daughter Megaera in marriage. Heracles and Megaera lived several happy years in Thebes, having 3 children and being admired by all the townsfolk for Heracles' role in protecting the city. Heracles' good fortune was seen by many on Olympus, but none watched as closely as Hera. This was not what she had planned for the bastard son of her husband. Not only had this illegitimate child stolen her power, but he was now in a happy marriage and was in line to become the next king of Thebes. This would not stand. The queen of the gods would not be disrespected. Heracles, completely oblivious to the scheming of Hera, came home one day to find his door broken down. Running inside, he found that his family was nowhere to be seen. When he cried out to them, several hideous monsters appeared from the back of the house and began to crawl towards him. Finding himself overcome with an unnatural rage, Heracles lashed out at the monsters, killing one instantly. The other monsters began to run away in a panic, but Heracles, now in a blind rage, would not allow any to escape, chasing them down and killing them with his bare hands. It was only then that Hera dispelled her magic, lifting her illusion from Heracles' eyes. The hero watched in horror as the monsters transformed back into their original form. His own family now lay dead before him. He frantically shook their bodies, trying to wake them up, tears flooding from his eyes. But it was too late. Hera's magic had done its job, and he would now forever live with the guilt of having murdered his own wife and children. As Heracles looked down at his blood-stained hands, he realized that he would have to atone for his crimes. The murder of a family member was considered one of the most serious crimes in ancient Greece. If Heracles did not atone for his crimes, then the Furies, monstrous creatures from the underworld, would hunt and then torture him for eternity. The only person he knew that could give him guidance was the famous Oracle of Delphi, and so he exiled himself from his home in Thebes and started his journey for redemption. The Oracle of Delphi was the mouthpiece of Apollo, able to deliver prophecies and guidance from the god. On this occasion, however, Hera managed to use her magic to influence some of the oracle's words. When Heracles asked what he should do to atone for his crimes, the oracle responded that he had to serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae for 10 years, who was the descendant of Perseus that had been born just mere seconds before Heracles. Just as Heracles was about to begin the journey, the oracle stopped him, saying that if he completed his service, then his father Zeus would make him immortal. Heracles bowed to the oracle, stood up, and made his way to Mycenae. Labour 1. The Nemean Lion. King Eurystheus had known of Heracles for some time and was deeply jealous of him. The two were cousins as they shared descent from Perseus, however they were nothing alike. Heracles was strong and heroic, whereas Eurystheus was cowardly and weak, often sending others to fight his battles for him. Arriving in servitude, Heracles bowed before his cousin Eurystheus, who could barely contain his joy. Quickly accepting Heracles' servitude, the king instructed him to carry out 10 labours over a period of 10 years. These labours, however, would have to be completed without any assistance or payment. Heracles hung his head in shame, asking what his first labour would be. King Eurystheus told him of a ferocious lion that had been terrorising a village in the northeast part of his kingdom named Nemean. The lion could not be stopped. Its golden hide was impervious to weapons, and its claws were sharper than any sword known to man. It had killed all those sent against it, and the task would now lay with Heracles, who was sent to slay the beast. Aware that no sword or spear could penetrate the lion's hide, Heracles trained for several months, uprooting trees and lifting boulders to increase his strength. Stronger than ever, he could now confront the beast with his hands. Upon arriving at the lion's den, Heracles passed the bodies of warriors, their swords and axes shattered on the floor. Walking through the lair, he began to strip away the armour and weaponry Athena had gifted him, while calling out to the beast. The lion appeared and began to charge towards him, but just before it was about to pounce, Heracles stepped to the side, catching its neck in his arms. The two wrestled for hours, but when Heracles managed to get a good grasp on the lion's throat, he squeezed with all his might until he heard a crack. The dead beast fell down to the floor. His first labour was complete. Heracles then paid respect to the lion, bowing his head hoping he hadn't caused any unnecessary suffering. Realising the lion's pelt would aid him in his upcoming labours, he pulled out one of its razor-sharp claws, using it to skin the animal. He then threw the pelt around his shoulders like a cloak, and used the lion's head as a protective hood. As Heracles left the lair, he passed the armour Athena had gifted him, leaving it on the floor, seeing it as a symbol of his old life. He then found a giant oak tree, which he lifted from the ground and stripped of its branches, whittling it into a club. This would be his new weapon, and the lion skin his new armour, symbols of his path to redemption. As Heracles returned to Mycenae, draped in the pelt of the Nemean lion, Eurystheus was shocked, never imagining he would make it back alive. Labour 2. The Lernaean Hydra. For his second labour, Heracles was sent to kill the Lernaean Hydra, and so he travelled to Lake Lerna near the city of Argos, where the fearsome water serpent had made its home. Known as the Hydra, this beast had 9 heads, one of which was immortal, with its blood the most poisonous substance known to man. Upon his journey to face the creature, however, Hera wanted to make the challenge more difficult, hiding a giant crab deep within the lake. When Heracles arrived, having gained confidence by his victory over the Nemean lion, he quickly ran towards the Hydra with his club in hand. With a massive swing, he took one of the Hydra's heads clean off, but to his horror, where one head had been, 2 new heads emerged in its place. Confused, Heracles began to cut off more heads, but this only made the situation worse. Each time one head was removed, 2 more would spawn. To make matters worse, Hera's giant crab then jumped out from the water, pinning Heracles to the ground. With the 2 monsters attacking him, Heracles was sure that his death was close. But as the Hydra moved towards him, an arrow flew out of the bushes and struck it in the side. Heracles turned around to see his nephew, Iolaus, aiming a bow at the monster. The boy had followed his uncle to the lake, hoping to help in any way he could. With the monsters distracted, Heracles reached for his club, swinging it with such force that he crushed the giant crab in a single blow. Moving out of harm's way, Iolaus came up with a way to defeat the Hydra. As Heracles sliced off a head, Iolaus would then cauterize the Hydra's neck with a flaming torch, preventing more heads from growing. The pair worked together for hours, slicing and cauterizing until only the immortal head remained. Heracles then cut off the immortal head, and with it still hissing, buried it under a large rock beside the lake. He then knelt beside the Hydra's body, dipping the tip of his arrows in its poisonous blood. The slightest scratch from one of these arrows would prove fatal, something that would aid him in his upcoming labours. Despite defeating the Hydra, Eurystheus did not count this labour, as Heracles had been assisted by his nephew Iolaus. An additional labour would therefore have to be completed, but Heracles was unaware of this at the time. As Heracles and Iolaus left the lake, to thank the crab for its service, Hera took its remains and cast its image up into the heavens, creating the constellation Cancer. Labour 3. The Ceryneian Hind. For his third labour, Heracles was ordered to catch the Ceryneian hind and bring it back alive to Eurystheus. The hind was a beautiful creature, much like a stag, with bronze-like hooves and a magnificent pair of golden antlers. Eurystheus had chosen the hind because not only was it extremely fast, being nearly impossible to catch, but it was also sacred to the goddess Artemis, who used the animals to pull her chariot. Eurystheus thought that even if Heracles was able to catch the hind, the goddess would in turn strike him down, with him being no match for an Olympian. Heracles then set off to Mount Ceryneian, chasing the hind for a full year before he was able to capture it. Not wanting to wound the animal, as the hind ran towards the river Ladon, Heracles shot an arrow near it, scaring it into the river. This slowed the hind down just enough so he could capture it, bind its legs and throw it over his shoulder. Heracles then made his way back to Mycenae, but as soon as he stepped outside of Mount Ceryneian with the hind, the goddess Artemis descended from Olympus, aiming her bow at the hero's chest, accusing him of trying to kill the animal. Heracles dropped to one knee, quickly explaining that the blame lay with King Eurystheus. Her twin brother Apollo then appeared and tried to de-escalate the situation. He argued that Eurystheus was under the command of Hera, who had resented them both as they were, just like Heracles, illegitimate children of Zeus. Taking pleasure in helping Hera's enemy, Artemis let Heracles pass, on the condition that he released the hind once his labour was complete. Heracles thanked the goddess and returned to Eurystheus, who was shocked to see his cousin return successful for the third time. After releasing the Hind back into the wild as instructed, Heracles asked his cousin for his fourth labour. Labour 4. The Eurymanthian Boar. For his fourth labour, Eurystheus sent Heracles to Mount Erymanthus to capture alive a giant boar that had been ravaging the area. Not thinking much of the task, Heracles set off with enthusiasm, even deciding to visit his friend the centaur Pholus along the way. Centaurs were half men, half horse creatures, renowned for acting more like beasts than humans. Pholus was an exception, however, being both friendly and intelligent, and had been friends with Heracles since his youth. After Heracles arrived, Pholus decided to host a dinner party to honour his guest, inviting a few of the local centaurs, one of whom was Heracles' old, intelligent and immortal archery teacher Chiron. As the feast began, everything was going well. They dined on roast meat, and Heracles reminisced with his old teacher before deciding to take a walk. On the way out, he came across a jar of wine on Pholus' shelf, which he decided to crack open and take a large helping of. Little did he know that the wine was communal property of all the centaurs, something the god Dionysus had gifted them 4 generations earlier. The wine also had a powerful odour that the centaurs could smell for miles around. As Heracles returned, he was confronted by a huge crowd of centaurs, demanding to know why he had drunk their wine. His friends Pholus and Chiron tried to calm down the other centaurs, but the situation soon got out of hand, as the whole tribe had arrived, drawn by the wine's odour. Enraged, the centaurs tried to kill Heracles, but despite their numbers they were unable to overpower him. In defence, Heracles began shooting them with his arrows coated in the poisonous Hydra blood, killing many with the rest then fleeing. Unfortunately, in the chaos Heracles had accidentally shot his teacher Chiron, who fell down screaming in agony. As he was immortal, the wound did not kill him, but with the Hydra's poison coursing through his veins, he would spend an eternity in pain. Zeus, however, had watched the events unfold and decided to take pity on the old centaur, taking Chiron's spirit and casting it up into the heavens, creating the constellation Sagittarius. Confused as to how such a small arrow had killed the other centaurs, Pholus picked up an arrow from the ground. As he lifted it up to his face to take a closer look, the arrow slipped from his fingers, landing on his foot, killing him instantly. After chasing the other centaurs away, Heracles returned, but when he found that he had killed both his friend and his teacher, he was overcome with shame and regret. Heracles solemnly buried Pholus's body, paid his respects, and then continued his journey to capture the Eurymanthian boar. Unknown to Heracles, a centaur called Nessus was able to survive the massacre, running far into the mountains, where he would spend over a decade planning his revenge on the hero. Heracles completed his actual labour with ease, chasing the boar into deep snow where he bound it in chains to bring back to Eurystheus. Upon seeing the giant monster, Eurystheus was petrified, quickly jumping into a large storage jar, refusing to come out until Heracles removed the boar from the room. Heracles could barely hide his amusement, but did as he was told and set the boar free. King Eurystheus then crawled out of the jar in embarrassment and quickly sent Heracles off on his 5th labour. Labour 5. The Augean Stables. For his 5th labour, Heracles was tasked to clean the Augean stables in a single day, using only his hands and without any assistance. Eurystheus believed the task to be impossible, sending Heracles on his way believing failure was certain. The stables belonged to King Augeas, from the neighbouring kingdom of Elis. They housed 3,000 immortal cattle and had not been cleaned for 30 years. The stables were so overrun with animal dung that in some places the filth had piled several metres high, and no one dared approach them due to their awful smell. The dung had also overflown into nearby pastures, which could no longer be ploughed for grain. Upon arriving in Elis, Heracles was greeted by an enthusiastic crowd of citizens. Word had spread of his labours, and with these beasts that had tormented many villages now gone, people looked to him as a hero. When he revealed that he had come to complete his 5th labour, the people encouraged him to visit King Augean and ask for some sort of reward. Heracles was convinced, and soon visited the king, who was happy to promise the hero 1/10 of his immortal herd if he was able to complete the task before nightfall. Thinking Heracles would fail, King Augean instructed his eldest son Phileus to observe. As he made his way over to the stables, Heracles was bombarded with a horrid smell. It was even larger and more filthy than he had imagined, spanning the length of a small city. After taking a look around, Heracles himself thought the task impossible to complete. He instead headed to the nearby rivers Alpheus and Peneus, which he hoped would do the job for him. Obeying the restrictions Eurystheus had given him, Heracles used no tools, instead using his bare hands to dig a canal, which flowed from the rivers down into the stables. Once completed, a great torrent of water came flooding into the stables, washing away years of filth in an instant. The water continued to flow into the surrounding farmland, fertilizing the fields with an enormous amount of manure. This caused celebration in Elis, with the people cheering for Heracles as their farms were to prosper for years to come. When King Augean found out what Heracles had done, he was furious, only having agreed to give Heracles a reward as he thought the task impossible. While Heracles had technically kept to the restrictions, using only his bare hands, Augean refused to acknowledge that he had completed the task properly, declining to pay him. Heracles proposed that the disagreement should be judged by leading citizens of Elis, many of whom had witnessed the labour. As the trial commenced, Augeas' son Phileus testified that Heracles had kept his side of the deal. Outraged, King Augean stood up mid-trial and banished Heracles and Phileus from Elis. He claimed Heracles had cheated as the river gods, not Heracles, had completed the task. To make matters worse, and unknown to Heracles at the time, Eurystheus would refuse to count this labour as one of the 10, as he claimed the task had been accomplished for payment, in the form of a portion of the immortal herd. Frustrated, Heracles began his journey back to Mycenae, so he could receive his next labour from King Eurystheus. While he could do nothing for now, he would later return after his labours were complete, to take revenge on King Augeas, who he would kill before making the king's son Phileus the new king of Elis. Heracles would mark this occasion by creating the famous Olympic Games, which would occur every 4 years in Elis. Labour 6. The Stymphalian Birds. For his 6th labour, Heracles was tasked with driving away a flock of man-eating birds from Lake Stymphalus. These birds were sacred to Ares and sported iron beaks, capable of tearing through the toughest of armour. When Heracles arrived at the lake, a problem had emerged. It would not be killing the birds that would prove difficult, but rather finding them amongst the dense, swampy marshland surrounding the lake. Even if he was able to find and kill some every day, it would take him well over a year to hunt them all down, time he simply didn't have if he was to complete all of his labours within 10 years. Luckily for Heracles, his father Zeus had been keeping an eye on him from the heavens. While Zeus didn't interfere directly, for fear of upsetting Hera further, he did ask the other gods assist Heracles when they could. In this instance, Athena was keeping watch on Heracles and saw an opportunity to help her half-brother. As Heracles was surveying the area, he suddenly heard the clanging of metal behind him. When he turned around, he saw a godly figure disappear into the dense wood. When he approached, he found a set of bronze rattles resting on the fallen trunk of an old willow tree, the quality of which could only have been made on Olympus. Thanking whatever gods had aided him, Heracles took the rattles to a nearby hill that overlooked the marsh. While the rattles did not sound like much to the hero, as he began to shake them, the noise they produced caused the birds enormous pain, with hundreds of them rising from the lake, crying out with frightening screams. As the birds soared up into the sky, they formed a great flock, to which Heracles took his aim. He drew back his bow, using the arrows dipped in the Hydra's blood to kill the birds instantly. Those that survived fled the lake, with Heracles' labour now complete. Labour 7. The Cretan Bull. When King Eurystheus saw his cousin returning successfully yet again, he realised that he had exhausted all of the difficult tasks within his kingdom. Needing more time to come up with one, he sent Heracles to Crete, an island near the Greek mainland, where King Minos would give him his next labour. King Minos had been gifted a beautiful white bull from the sea god Poseidon, with the expectation that he would sacrifice the bull in Poseidon's honour. Instead of doing this, however, King Minos decided to keep the bull for himself, thinking it too beautiful to kill. In revenge, Poseidon made the king's wife fall in love with the bull, with this union eventually leading to the birth of the half-man, half-bull creature known as the Minotaur, a creature that King Minos kept in a labyrinth beneath his palace. After the bull impregnated the king's wife, Poseidon turned it mad, with the bull running around Crete destroying everything in its path. While Heracles was not destined to kill the Minotaur beneath the palace, that was a task destined for the hero Theseus, King Minos did want Heracles to capture the mad bull that was causing havoc in his kingdom. Having already wrestled with the Nemean lion, Heracles was confident that he could overpower the bull. When he found the giant creature, it charged towards him. He was able to skillfully grab it by the horns, wrestling it to the ground. The two fought for hours until the exhausted beast finally submitted to Heracles. As the bull was a child of Poseidon, it could walk on water, and so Heracles jumped on its back and rode it across the ocean to Mycenae. When Heracles arrived with the bull, Eurystheus was terrified to see yet another mythical animal in his palace, again hiding in a storage jar, refusing to come out until Heracles had removed the beast. Not wanting to kill an animal sacred to Poseidon, Heracles released the bull outside of the palace, where it went on to rampage around the Greek mainland until it was finally caught and killed by the hero Theseus. Labour 8. The Mares of Diomedes. For his 8th labour, Heracles was tasked with bringing Eurystheus the mares of the Thracian king Diomedes. These horses were fearsome creatures, known to breathe fire, with their aggression made worse by Diomedes feeding them the flesh of unsuspecting guests and strangers to his kingdom. As Heracles made his way to Thrace, he would be accompanied by his friend and lover Abderus, the son of Hermes. As they arrived, the pair made their way to the palace of Diomedes, where they witnessed the fire-breathing horses Heracles was tasked with collecting. The mares were bound to the palace wall with cast iron chains, put on display for all to see, thrashing around and foaming at the mouth. Beside them lay a bucket of human flesh, making Abderus distressed and hesitant to enter the palace. He decided to wait outside, while Heracles entered the palace to begin negotiation. Heracles then approached King Diomedes, who was a foul-looking man with a nauseous stench. His eyes darted around in madness, and had blood caked under his fingernails, human flesh left over from feeding the mares. While Heracles was revolted by the king, he managed to compose himself enough to open negotiations for the horses. Not long into the discussion, Heracles heard a scream from outside. Rushing out to see what had happened, he watched in horror as the horses ripped into the corpse of his young lover Abderus, who had gotten too close to them in his curiosity. Filled with rage, Heracles charged back into the palace, killing the guards and grabbing Diomedes by the hair, dragging him outside. Giving the king a taste of his own medicine, Heracles threw Diomedes to the monsters, who began to devour their master. The flesh of Diomedes was so foul, however, that the horses stopped eating him halfway through, forever put off the taste of human flesh. With the horses docile, Heracles grabbed their chains and brought them back to Eurystheus. Disappointed by their passivity, King Eurystheus put the beasts in his personal stable, keeping them for his royal collection. Labour 9. The Girdle of Hippolyta. For his 9th labour, Heracles was tasked to retrieve the Girdle of Hippolyta, a gold and leather belt that ensured victory in battle. This task, however, was not given by King Eurystheus, but instead the king's daughter Admete. Admete admired Heracles, but there was someone she admired more, the fabled queen of the Amazons, Hippolyta. The Amazons were a race of warrior women who lived at the edges of the known world. They could fight better than any man, with them routinely raiding local tribes to assert their dominance. Their leader was Queen Hippolyta, daughter of the war god Ares, who had received a magic girdle from her father, ensuring that she never fell in battle. It was this girdle that Admete desired Heracles to retrieve, as it was something that belonged to her hero. So Heracles set off east, bringing with him a small band of warriors in case he had to fight the Amazons. On arrival, Heracles was surprised by the Amazons' hospitality, with them offering his men food and shelter. This was far from the ferocious and hostile reaction he had expected. Hippolyta herself was particularly interested in Heracles, as she had heard of his great quests and labours. She invited Heracles into her private residence, where she quizzed him about his legendary adventures. The two found that they got on very well, with Heracles suddenly reluctant to take the girdle from her. He decided to tell the truth, explaining his 9th labour and Admete's wish. To his surprise, Hippolyta was all too happy to gift him the girdle, immediately placing it in his hands as a sign of friendship. Hera could not believe her eyes. The task was going too well. Her hatred for Heracles had grown stronger with each labour he completed, so to make this labour more difficult, she decided to intervene. Disguising herself as an Amazon, she made her way into the camp, walking amongst the women sowing seeds of distrust. She slowly convinced the entire tribe that Heracles had come to enslave them, with his ultimate objective to kidnap Hippolyta and take her back to Greece. The Amazons were outraged. Mounting their horses, they charged towards the men they had let into their camp. Heracles heard the commotion and rushed outside, where he saw the Amazons slaughtering his friends. He turned around in rage, thinking that Hippolyta had tricked him, keeping him away from his men so they could be slaughtered. Before the queen could explain, Heracles lifted his club and struck her dead. Her girdle did not protect her, as she had already gifted it to Heracles. Heracles then ran outside, striking down any Amazon who challenged him. He managed to save a small handful of his companions, and the group hastily left camp, heading home to Mycenae. When Heracles returned, he gave the girdle to Admete, sparing her the details of how he acquired it. Eurystheus had grown tired of Heracles beating any task laid before him, and so decided to send him to the furthest place he could think of, the island of Erythea, so he didn't have to deal with his cousin for a while. Labour 10. The Cattle of Geryon. For his 10th labour, Heracles was sent to Erythea to steal the cattle of a 3-headed giant known as Geryon. And so Heracles began the long journey to the edge of the world, to what he thought would be his 10th and final labour. Heading southwest, he travelled along the African coastline, but it did not take long for Heracles, unused to the intense and scorching heat of the continent, to become annoyed with the sun itself. Halfway across the Libyan desert, he took out his bow and threatened to shoot the sun with one of his poisoned arrows if it continued to torment him. Quite distressed at this, the sun came down in its human form as the god Helios, begging Heracles not to shoot him. He promised to shine less intensely while Heracles was on his journey, also offering to give the hero his great golden cup, a vessel shaped like a water lily that Helios used to sail around the ocean in at night. Accepting the god's gift, Heracles was able to quickly sail and continue his journey in the magic cup. When he reached the entrance to the Atlantic Ocean, he decided to celebrate his great voyage by setting up 2 pillars, one on the African side of the entrance and the other on the European side. These would later be called the Pillars of Hercules, known today as Ceuta on the African side and the Rock of Gibraltar on the European side. As Heracles continued, he found himself caught in stormy waters, and so again pulled out his arrows, this time threatening the great titan Oceanus. Frightened of the poisoned arrows, Oceanus calmed the waves, with Heracles continuing his journey. Finally reaching the island of Erythea, Heracles was quick to see the herd of cattle he had to steal, along with Geryon, their giant 3-headed owner. Before Heracles could fight the three-headed giant, however, he was confronted by the cattle's giant herdsman Eurytion, the son of Ares, and Orthos, the two-headed dog and brother of Cerberus. But such threats proved trivial to Heracles, who simply crushed them both with his club. Wanting to be done with his final task as swiftly as possible, Heracles didn't bother to fight Geryon, instead shooting the three-headed giant with a poisoned arrow, killing him within seconds. Heracles herded the cattle into Helios's cup and started to sail home. When he arrived in Greece, however, Hera decided to intervene yet again. She sent a swarm of gadflies to disturb the cattle, with their painful stings causing the cattle to disperse, some of whom ran off into the Thracian mountains. Heracles chased after the cattle, but was unable to capture all of them. Arriving back in Mycenae a month or so later, Heracles returned the magic cup to Helios and delivered what remained of the herd to Eurystheus, who decided to sacrifice them to Hera. Heracles let out a sigh of relief. He was done. 10 years and 10 labours later, he could finally walk away a free man, cleansed of his past crimes. Little did he know that his hardest labours were yet to come, for Hera had visited Eurystheus the night before and reminded him about the original terms of the labours. Heracles was to complete his tasks with no assistance and no payment. For his second labour, Heracles had received help from his nephew Iolaus in defeating the Lernaean Hydra, and in his fifth labour had accepted payment from King Augean to clean the Augean stables, even though he never received payment. So much to Heracles' distress, Eurystheus revealed that the hero still owed him 2 labours, refusing to pardon or release him until he completed a new total of 12. Not only this, but his next task was to be the most difficult yet. Labour 11. The Apples of the Hesperides. For his 11th labour, Heracles was tasked with travelling to the garden of the Hesperides, the daughters of the night, and collecting the golden apples that grew on a tree there, which granted immortality to anyone who ate them. Not only was the location of the garden unknown, but Hera had sent a 100-headed dragon called Ladon to guard the tree from which the apples grew. As Heracles set off to find the mythical garden, he first visited the Titan Prometheus, who he thought would know of its location. Prometheus had stolen the fire of the gods and given it to humanity near the beginning of creation, providing humans with warmth as well as the ability to cook food and forge metal. As a punishment for this theft, Zeus tied Prometheus to a large rock on the side of a tall mountain, sending an eagle there to eat his liver every day for eternity. As Prometheus was immortal, the liver would grow back every night, only to be devoured by the eagle the next day. By the time Heracles found him, this cycle of punishment had been going on for centuries. Taking pity on Prometheus, Heracles broke his chains and shot down the eagle from the sky. Grateful for being set free, Prometheus was happy to share the location of the garden, although he warned Heracles that no mortal could pick the golden apples from the tree. Instead, he suggested that Heracles seek help from the Titan Atlas, as he lived near the garden. Ignoring the advice Prometheus had given, Heracles was confident he could pick the apples himself. When he arrived, he climbed over a great wall that surrounded the garden, and was then confronted by Ladon, the 100-headed dragon. He shot the dragon with one of his poisoned arrows, killing it instantly, and then approached the apple tree. When he tried to take an apple, however, it disappeared, his fingers moving through where the apple once was. Prometheus had been telling the truth. Heracles needed an immortal to do it for him. He then went to find Atlas, which was not difficult due to the Titan's immense size. Atlas had fought against the Olympians in the war between the gods and the Titans, but as he was defeated, Zeus forced him to hold up the sky for eternity as punishment. Approaching the Titan, Heracles explained his situation and offered to make a trade. He would temporarily hold up the sky and give Atlas a much-needed break, and in exchange, Atlas would collect the golden apples. Thankful to be free of his burden even for a short time, Atlas accepted the deal and went to collect the apples, transferring the weight of the heavens onto the shoulders of Heracles. Although he had achieved the impossible before, even Heracles struggled to bear the immense weight he now had to hold. As time went on, his muscles began to cramp, His body began to shake, and he contemplated whether this would be the task that would finally break him. As the sun began to set, Atlas finally returned with a basket full of golden apples. With a grunt of relief, Heracles thanked the Titan, moving to give him back the sky. Not wanting to take it back, Atlas offered to take the apples to Eurystheus himself, promising he would return and bear the weight of the sky once more. But Heracles would not be fooled. He thanked the Titan for his generous offer to deliver the apples, and offered to hold the sky for a little longer, but asked if Atlas would take the sky back, just for a moment, so he could put on his pelt to cushion his shoulders and head. Knowing the pelt would make a great difference, and none the wiser, Atlas placed the apples on the ground and took back the sky from Heracles. As soon as he was set free, Heracles picked up the apples and bid Atlas farewell. Atlas was enraged, cursing at the hero as he left, with his roars shaking the ground for miles around. Returning to Eurystheus, Heracles presented him the fabled golden apples. Even Eurystheus seemed impressed at this, though he did his best not to show it. Hera had warned him that he could not keep the apples as they belonged in the sacred garden, and so he left them in Athena's temple overnight, with the goddess returning them to their rightful place. Labour 12. The Capture of Cerberus. For his 12th and final labour, Heracles was tasked with capturing Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of the underworld. As Heracles began his journey, the messenger god Hermes appeared before him. Knowing that Heracles would not be able to navigate the dark and winding halls of the dead by himself, Hermes had come to help guide his half-brother in his final task. He warned Heracles that it would be wise to ask the permission of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the underworld, before taking their dog, as to not incur their wrath. Thanking the god for his advice, Heracles and Hermes made their way to Hades' palace. Approaching the king and queen, Heracles explained that he had been tasked with collecting Cerberus as his final labour. Knowing that helping Heracles would infuriate Hera, who had always looked down on him, Hades allowed Cerberus to be taken, but two conditions had to be met. First, Heracles must use no weapons to capture Cerberus, and second, once his task was complete, Cerberus must be returned. Agreeing to the terms, Heracles set out to face the beast. Just as he had done with the Nemean lion and the Cretan bull before, Heracles grappled with the dog, wrestling it for hours until the beast was utterly exhausted. With his club in one hand and Cerberus in the other, he dragged the dog by its chains and made his way back to the realm of the living. Just before crossing back over the river Styx, the spirit of Medusa appeared before quickly disappearing into one of the underworld's many tunnels. Turning around in shock, Heracles drew his sword, but when he looked around, he saw standing the spirit of his old friend Meleager. Meleager revealed his recent death, and the two engaged in conversation. Heracles then offered to marry Deianira, Meleager's sister, in honour of his death. Thanking the hero for his offer, Meleager faded back amongst the spirits of the dead. Heracles then delivered Cerberus to King Eurystheus, who once again chose to cower in his jar, a now permanent installation next to his throne. The king poked his head out the top of the jar, and while shaking in fear, agreed to release Heracles from his servitude, granting him pardon for his past crimes. Heracles was filled with joy. He had finally atoned for his crimes and was to be a free man. But before embarking on his next journey, he fulfilled his promise and returned Cerberus to the land of the dead. Heracles took some time to celebrate when he returned, enjoying all the pleasures of a free life. He was now a well-renowned hero and had admirers wherever he went. He would go on several more adventures, even joining the hero Jason and the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece. Heracles soon decided to fulfill the promise that he had made to the spirit of Meleager in his final labour, finding his sister Deianira and taking her as his wife. As the newlywed couple were making their way to their new home in the city of Tiryns, they came across a rapid river that they had to pass. On the other bank stood a centaur, who made his way over and offered to carry Deianeira across on his back. Heracles accepted the offer, not recognizing the centaur as Nessus, the sole survivor of the massacre Heracles had committed against the centaur tribe on his way to his fourth labour. Nessus had been plotting his revenge against Heracles for over a decade, with him now seeing the perfect opportunity to execute his plan. As soon as Nessus reached the other side of the river, he threw Deianeira to the floor and attempted to violate her. Seeing this from the other bank, Heracles pulled out his bow and shot Nessus through the chest with a poisoned arrow, sending the centaur to the ground in agonizing pain. In his last breaths, Nessus apologized to Deianeira and offered her a gift as a means of apology. He claimed that his blood had magic love properties, telling Deianeira to discreetly collect it up in a vial in case Heracles ever fell in love with another woman. As Nessus finally died, Deianeira collected up his blood, keeping it hidden in case she ever needed to win Heracles back. Little did she know that she had just begun the chain of events that would lead to the death of her husband. The couple lived happily in Tiryns for a time and had several children. However, after a few years, Heracles became tired of such a peaceful life and craved some of the action of his youth. Seeking some adventure, he left his family behind and set out to the kingdom of Orcelia, where his old archery tutor Eurytus ruled as king. Once he arrived, it took only a few days for Heracles to fall in love with the daughter of King Eurytus, a woman named Iole. King Eurytus was currently holding an archery tournament to decide who would marry Iole, a contest Heracles decided to enter. However, when Heracles won, King Eurytus refused to hand his daughter over, as he had heard of how Heracles had murdered his first family and had no desire to put Iole in similar danger. Heracles stormed out of the palace in a rage, but would later return to kidnap Iole along with other women from the city. He would bring them back home to where his children and wife Deianeira were living. While Deianeira was initially happy to see her husband return, she had become worried when she saw him arrive with a group of captive women. The way he looked at Iole in particular was troubling, making her correctly suspect that Heracles had been unfaithful. In her desperation to win Heracles back, Deianeira retrieved the blood of the centaur Nessus that she had been hiding, hoping that its love properties would help her. She smeared the blood on a robe, which she then gifted to Heracles, asking him to wear it to dinner that evening. When Heracles put on the robe later that evening, he immediately knew that something was wrong. Nessus's blood began to stick to his skin, causing a horrible burning sensation. Heracles began to scream in agony and tried to rip off the robe, tearing out large chunks of his flesh in the process. The centaur Nessus had planned this all along. He knew that Heracles would shoot him with a poisoned arrow when he attempted to attack Deianeira. By convincing Deianeira to gather his blood that was tainted with the Hydra poison, Nessus had craftily ensured that Heracles would suffer the same agonizing death that he had inflicted on the other centaurs. Heracles' torment lasted for hours, with his wife Deianeira hanging herself upon realizing what she had done. Knowing his death was close, Heracles frantically ran around his courtyard, ripping up trees to construct a funeral pyre. Once assembled, the hero lay down upon it and asked one of his friends to set it alight. As the fire seared through his skin and his body went up in flames, a smile appeared on Heracles' face as he was finally released from the horrific pain. It was at this moment a great storm cloud gathered around the funeral pyre. In the cloud sat Zeus, who watched as the mortal part of his son burnt away. The god then grabbed Heracles' spirit, taking his son up to Olympus, where he transformed him into an immortal.